Welcome everybody. The meeting tonight is about real identity, who really is a very, very famous character, and this is the primal, the ultimate urban myth of rock and roll. Was the world's greatest band in mid-60s, did it suddenly suffer a death and had to keep it secret? And was there a replacement? This rumbled on underground for many years, and I think it's a lot to do with the idea of the empire having socially acceptable superstar heroes that will say what they're told to say. And the idea of pop stars being replaceable, or having to know they might be replaceable, I think it's very relevant to the kind of thing we look at here. And also the question whether a psychological institution like the Tavistock Institute or whatever, or the CIA, whether it manipulates public opinion and perceptions. Anyone who's been to Mark's talk will understand this, the way they see pop music as vital to control because of the way it influences the hearts and minds of the young. We had 3 years Beatlemania raged around planet Earth, and it was everybody was gripped by it, and it was kind of near hysteria. Centre was Paul McCartney, the beautiful boy, who looked like he was too happy and too beautiful to live. He was very much at the centre of Beatlemania, and then suddenly, at the end of their American tour, end of August 1966, suddenly the world's greatest band could never play another public concert. Suddenly, they could never sell another ticket, and the manager had to put out rather lame excuses about what the band were doing and how he couldn't say when the next tour would be, and so forth, suddenly the band very much disintegrated. Then when it started off the next year, it was very, very different. It was 4 lonely people, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. That amazing unity of seeing Paul and John singing to the microphone together, that bliss was gone forever. And instead you had 4 lonely people, and Fool had the view, he said he didn't want, I'm calling him Fool, the mysterious replacement, who is and ever remains mysterious, because we can't solve the riddle of where he came from. Paul is said to have said to John, "We're not having any more silly love songs." And John said, "What do you mean? That's all we do." So they kind of grew up. You had a more mature style coming, these 4 lonely people, and the amazing Sgt. Pepper band came, and albums that many people feel were their best. For example, Abbey Road, or the White Album, and the immortal Sgt. Pepper. These were done after the Cataclysm. Okay? And this talk tonight, we're going to look at, my book had a fairly simple replacement. Simple in the sense that there was one guy who died, then another guy who came in from the cold and was the replacement. And in a way, I think Mark's first volume of music, he kind of put that forward. And then he kind of wondered, well, maybe that isn't the whole story. Maybe there are several Paul McCartneys. And I think his second book, Volume 2 of Musical Truth, you get more the several different identities. And it may be, it's normal to have doubles. If you've got a big pop star, the manager will want a double just in case he gets ill or something. The double will go along to the concert or the tour and stand in if he's ill. But that is not a replacement. It may be a warning to the pop star that, watch it, you may be a bit more replaceable than you think. Anyway, here, just to remind ourselves, is the real James Paul McCartney. Okay? And he had chocolate brown eyes. It's terribly important to remember. You can watch films such as Help, which are colour. And that's so important to see the eye colour. That's what the girls would swoon about, chocolate brown eyes, and here they are. They're the same height, and that's fierce controversy how high they were. Some people say they were about 5'8". Other people say no, they're 5'10". So it's by no means agreed, but he was the same height as John, as Lennon. And in a way, the story of why they could never play together after August '66 was that the new guy was taller. He was taller, he was bigger, he had bigger shoes, longer head, party on the other side, and he just couldn't possibly sing into the mic together with John. That could not happen. Okay, here's the true story of the Beatles. About 63 or something? 62? 64. And you may think, well, that sounds fairly straightforward, but actually we never knew who Bill Shepherd was. Who was Bill Shepherd? But William Shepherd certainly comes in, that story comes in a lot. We get, now you start to wonder, is this the real Paul? This is an interview in '66, last American tour, and his face is very round. We sort of presume it is the same Paul, but some people aren't too sure. But the guy on the other side is definitely the replacement. He's got a longer face, and he has to go through a lot of plastic surgery and Botox to try and look like a Beatle. He's a much more intellectual, complicated, reflexive character. Okay? Then you see that the massive hit Hey Jude, everyone says, oh, well, that's so awesome. That's got to be the original Paul McCartney, hasn't it? Hey Jude. I mean, what genius. Yes, it was genius. There was real genius there. And if you read this, Billy Shears, Memoirs of Billy Shears, this is basically written by Sir Paul McCartney, I would say. He says he feels he was getting messages from the dead Paul, the real Paul, to inspire him some of his great songs. That's what he said. And Hey Jude is like one of them. If you feel that must be the original spirit of the original Paul singing to you in Hey Jude. So you've got, that's a simple contrast, I would say, of fallen Paul. Okay? This is the very early Paul, who doesn't look at all like Paul. There was the amazing development through 1967 whereby he came to look more like a Beatle. Okay? This was a great masterpiece. And that this figure here, you see in Sgt. Pepper, that is actually a blend, I would say, a blend of the old and new Pauls. That's probably your picture of what you think Paul McCartney looks like. And it's kind of in between the two of them. And that is the process whereby most people now, their picture of Paul McCartney is the new guy. Okay? So this guy's, they all turn up with moustaches at this period, partly to hide the surgery that Paul was having. Okay, so here is '67. So there's Paul. You can see him. They've all got moustaches. That's early '67. But they no longer wear the same gear. Never wear the same gear together. Think of the old Beatles when Paul was still there. They'd all wear the same suits, and Brian Epstein would tell them how to show that amazing synchrony that everybody loved. Here they're four different individuals, okay? There's the mystery of September the 11th, which is a haunting mystery. That story goes right through the Beatles. The very first recording in Abbey Road was September the 11th. The legend of Paul driving out in his fast car and crashing it, that is on September the 11th. And then there's the Melody Maker Awards on the 13th, which probably not time to go into, but the idea is that he wasn't really there. That's quite a big story, but there are no, I'll say there's doubtful whether there are any authentic pictures of Paul there. Okay, that is an important picture. I think that might be the very first picture of the new guy. 17th of November, he's turning up at Abbey Road Studios. They're going to record Strawberry Fields. And here he is. He's a brilliant musician. I think he writes music. It's doubtful whether the old Paul did ever write music. This guy is a session musician, plays all sorts of instruments. He's turning up, and so that is one of the first pictures of him. That's a nice one also. He's just outside the house that Paul had in St John's Wood. A super luxury home that Paul had got. And so the new guy just inherits this the luxury house and his girlfriend, Joan Asher. So everyone was kind of quite jealous of him. Have you got it made? So that is a kind of shy picture. He could not yet appear in public. When some fans saw him outside Paul's home, they kind of wondered who he was, so they asked who he was. He didn't look enough like a Beatle yet to be shown in public. When John Lennon was first told about this plan to have a replacement step in and met this guy, he said, okay, but we can never perform in public. He said, you'll never look like a Beatle. So this is the new guy who doesn't yet look like a Beatle. That is the November of '66, right? And again, this picture is not remotely like the old Paul McCartney. And distant echo is saying, who the hell is this guy? And here he is at work next to George Martin, and they're composing something. So here again, you can see his much longer face, and the New Musical Express has put him separate from the others, as if they're not sure whether he really is supposed to look like the same one. It's a much longer face. This came out 9909 on 2009, September the 9th. It's got 666 pages, 66 chapters, so it's by somebody into number mysticism or magic. The author kind of agreed to transcribe it. I would say it's pretty obviously written by Sir Paul McCartney. And it's his account of the whole drama, but he draws a veil of who he was before he came into the band. He does claim, I think, that he was with this awful group, the Pepper Pots, Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots. If you listen to the frightful noise these people make, people have been hard-pressed to believe.
Never seen that album.
You've never seen it? Oh, well, there you go, two of them. I would suggest, if you want to ask yourself, they're playing a load of Beatles songs here, a load of cover songs, so it's the same company.
It's got William Shepherd name check on it. No, just Billy Pepper.
I don't think so. It just says it's Billy Pepper. That's what they call Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots.
No photos.
There are no photos of this group, except for that, which is actually another band. But so it's something about not showing the face of this guy. If you want to wonder, what does this sound like? This is what Paul produced once he left the Beatles, around 1970. Okay, he's with Linda McCartney, and he makes this, and he wants to get away from being the Beatle. That's why he wants to link up with Linda McCartney, because she understands what's happened, and she will accept him for who he is, love him for, help him to develop and be who he wants to be, and develop wings and so on. So this is when he's given up being a Beatle and wants to try and find his own voice. Okay, I mean, I don't much like it, but I suggest, if you want to ask what does this guy singing here sound like, you might feel it sounds a bit like this. So whatever happened in the Abbey Road studios to produce the Beatle magic is not there in these albums. Okay, anyway, that's just a thought of what the voice sounds like.
Who's the author of the book? The author of that book?
Well, that's a very good question. It's given us Thomas E. Hugh Harriet, but thanking Sir Paul McCartney for the material. And you see, it has to be deniable in a court of law. He has to write it, he's writing it in the first person, the whole drama, but he has to legally be able to deny it and claim that it's fiction, because otherwise the whole vast billion-pound enterprise...
He'd be up to his neck in lawsuits.
Be up to his neck in lawsuits, and Heather, his daughter, might not get a penny. So it has to be, that's a big question. When Sir Paul dies, will he stipulate in his will that DNA could be taken or not? You know, because that will be immediately a thing, the vast financial empire, who will it go to? Anyway, do you want to say anything about that book?
Well, I'm going to get onto that book. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a very funny sequel come out to this 9 years later, but I found this very remarkable, inspiring, and for the book that I wrote, I felt it was generally authentic. Yeah. Okay, over to you, Mark.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it's for very good reason that I refer to this subject matter as the McCartney mindfuck, because when you fall down this particular, no pun intended, fall, get it? When you fall down this particular rabbit hole, you're not getting out again in a hurry, trust me. And this can easily swallow up months, weeks, years of your life that you're never going to get back. Trust me on that. I'm going to be recapping on some of the things that Nick has just mentioned and going through some of the different takes that various researchers have on what we might be looking at here with this whole thing. So there's a lot of disagreement among McCartney researchers as to whether we're looking at one straight replacement, whether the original Paul actually died or just faded into obscurity, or whether in fact he's still around, whether we're looking at multiple replacements. But the one consistent factor in all of it that we can all agree on is there has been more than one Paul McCartney. That's pretty much the only definitive statement you can make in all of this, I feel. There's definitely been more than one guy. What we're not looking at is one guy, James Paul McCartney, who's been there from day one to present day. So let's get into some of the different takes on this whole thing. The conventional conspiracy theory, as Nick just mentioned, is that in 1966, and the two favoured dates for this are 11th of September and the 9th of November. 9th of November. Both those dates encode as 9/11, depending on whether you're looking at the US date format or the British date format. But there's clues and little hints and indications that 9/11 of 1966 was the date when Paul McCartney died, according to the official version of this. So it is a myth. It is an urban legend, and there appear to have been many clues and pointers deliberately planted into the Beatles' output to indicate that this was the case. Two of the best album sleeves that we have to analyse would be, first off, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was released on the 1st of June 67. So this is supposed to be the year after the replacement supposedly took place. And this album cover is loaded with clues. Over on the right-hand side, the far right, which is sadly just a little bit cut off from this image, you've got a toy doll, which is wearing a T-shirt with the slogan, "Welcome the Rolling Stones," written on it. And there's a bloody driving glove next to the doll, covered in blood. And there's also a toy car posed next to her as well, which you can't see on this image, sadly. You've got the old-style Beatles here from their early period in their black suits, looking down forlornly on what is clearly a grave with the word Beatles spout out in the flowers here. So it appears to be the old incarnation of the group, which by this point was finished. She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand was finished. Now we're into the psychedelic experimental era, phase 2 of the Beatles. So they seem to be mourning the passing of the group. And another clue, which you don't see straight away, but once it's pointed out to you, it just leaps out at you every time, well it does to me anyway, is that in what the band are wearing here, it might be a little bit difficult to see in this image, but you've got the sort of sashes on their costumes. And when you draw an outline around the shape that these all make, you get the word Paul. So this is the P here. Then you have the A, the U, and going up there to that looped thing on the robe there, it's spelling out the word Paul. And like I say, every time you see the image, once that's been pointed out to you, you'll be able to see it quite clearly. Another thing which somebody noticed early on is if you hold a mirror up halfway along the drum, where it says Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, you get an interesting mirror effect. And it creates the phrase in the middle of the drum, I1IX, he die, which if you ascribe numerical values to what we're getting there, it spells out basically 9/11, he die. So that appears to be something that was deliberately... Or 11/9, depending on how you interpret it. It appears to be something that was deliberately placed in this album sleeve. Then the other one, of course, is Abbey Road, which came out in 1969. And it was around about this time, October 1969, when the whole idea of McCartney having died really broke into the public consciousness in America, where you had a bunch of students on different university campuses that were phoning up radio stations and poring over these different Beatles albums for clues to suggest that Paul was actually dead. And Abbey Road was the one that was most focused in on, particularly on the show by the DJ Russ Gibb on a Detroit radio station, which first kind of broke the story into the mainstream. So you've got the four Beatles walking across the zebra crossing here. And McCartney is out of step with the others, and he's wearing a sort of loosely fitting suit. And the four Beatles are presumed to be representing different figures in a funeral procession. So you've got John in white as the priest. Ringo in a black suit is supposed to be a pallbearer. Again, no pun intended. Then you have McCartney, who's supposed to be the corpse, and George in denim is supposed to be the gravedigger, according to how this sleeve has been interpreted. So this all came out in 1969, which is supposedly 3 years after this event took place, if you go for that version of the story. And according to this book, which I'm going to get onto, the Beatles camp deliberately planted these clues in the hope that they would be interpreted, in the hope that the message could be conveyed in that cryptic way. I've got a couple of audio clues to play you now, because as well as the pictorial visual ones in the album sleeves, there were clues put into the Beatles' music, both in the form of backmasking, so reversed messages that can only be properly interpreted when the recording is played backwards, and hidden little messages which could be heard forwards if you know where to look for them. So the first one, are we playing? Play that again. Just at the point where the music starts to fade, what you're supposed to hear is a voice saying, "I buried Paul." So have another listen. That's in the play-out groove for Strawberry Fields Forever, which came out in January 1967. Now, Lennon, who is supposedly the one that planted that message in the recording, addressed it in an interview where he was directly asked about it. And he said that he wasn't saying, "I buried Paul," the whole thing is ridiculous. He was actually saying cranberry sauce. But in another version of the story, in a later interview, he claimed he was saying, "I'm very bored." So we've got different variations on what's actually being said. But the idea is that he was communicating the truth of what had happened by saying, "I buried Paul." And we're going to get into masterful speaking and placing the truth in plain sight as we go on as well, which are tenets of Freemasonry and occult mystery schools. And the Beatles were very much caught up in all of that. Next audio clue is from the track Revolution Number 9. I can't really call it a song because it's actually a mishmash of different sounds in an avant-garde kind of fashion. And this was from the White Album, released in 1968. This is a very famous Paul is Dead clue.
Number nine.
So it starts off with a studio announcer, an engineer in EMI Studios, saying number 9, as in take number 9 of the recording. However, when the recording is reversed,
Number nine. Number nine. Underman. 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 Underman.
not my graphics,
Underman.
somebody else's from YouTube.
Underman. Underman. Underman.
So, incredibly, number 9 forwards, when played backwards, is taken to sound like "Turn Me On, Dead Man." I've tried recording myself saying number 9. It sounds nothing like that in reverse, but in this particular case, that's what you get. And that is an accurate reverse rendering of that particular recording. That's supposed to be another clue. Yeah. Turn Me On, Dead Man. Turn Me On was the kind of LSD parlance of that era. So we had the two famous Beatles compilation albums that came out in the early 80s. The Red Album, which documented their early era, 62 to 66, and then the Blue Album, which was the 67 to 70 period. What we actually have here is two different Pauls. There's Paul number 1 in the second position there. By the time they brought out the next album, they've switched Pauls. He's in the same position, but it's a different guy. And we have the Red and Blue albums in the same way, that we have the red and blue versions of the memoirs of Billy Shears. And this again alludes to Freemasonry, as in red lodges and blue lodges representing different factions of Freemasonry, which we'll get into as well. As Nick mentioned, the primary candidate for the replacement has always been an individual by the name of William Shepherd. He's sometimes referred to as William Campbell. There seems to be some confusion over whether it's William Campbell Shepherd or William Shepherd or Campbell, but the most common name is Billy Shepherd. And he had a history with the Beatles, as Nick mentioned, having been the author of that book that he showed you from 1964. And he would also appear to have been the Billy Pepper of Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots, and that's how the Sgt. Pepper album came to be named in that way. The first memoirs was published on the 9th of September 2009, so it's 999. Or if you do an inversion of that number, you get 666. And these numbers crop up time and time again in the numerology and the symbolism connected to the Beatles, and specifically to this character. This book purports to be the McCartney replacement telling his story and spilling the beans on what actually happened. The book is credited to an author, or an encoder as he's called, by the name of Thomas Hugh Harriot. And he is based in Salt Lake City, Utah. He appears to be, or have been, a Mormon, and he's also a Freemason. And he is the guy that was given the job of authoring this book and loading it with codes as well, acrostical codes, which can be deciphered in different ways to get other messages. But this book purports to be the McCartney replacement, telling it like it is. And what he says is that the original Paul knew that he was going to die. He says he was getting these really terrifying, dark premonitions leading up to 1966, and he was foreshadowing his own imminent death. And this did indeed happen, according to the book, on the 11th of September 1966. And in this first version of the book, it takes you through that first week after the supposed car accident in which McCartney is said to have been pretty much decapitated. And he's supposed to have picked up a girl called Donna as well, right? As a hitchhiker. There's supposed to have been a girl present in this accident as well. The book takes you through this first week of Brian Epstein breaking the news to John Lennon of what had happened to Paul, and how all the Beatles reacted to it, and how they very quickly worked to get this guy in to replace Paul so that the public would be none the wiser. So this guy, William Shepherd, is supposed to be a Freemason also, comes from a high-ranking Freemasonic family. He was a session musician. He was in Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots. He's supposed to have also been in an early 1960s group called the Diplomats, alongside Denny Lane, who later cropped up in the lineup for his band Wings in the 1970s. And he was groomed for the role, so he says. He says he was born in 1937, so he's 5 years older than biological Paul, which makes him 82 years of age this year. And the book expresses the fact very clearly that it is historical fiction, and it presents itself as a novel. And the reason for this, as Nick mentioned, is there has to be plausible deniability should anyone ever try and bring any kind of legal case against you, Harriet, and whoever else is involved in this book. So they've loaded it with certain fictional embellishments which can be shown to be that. If it ever came to it, they could point to some of the content of this book and say, well, look, this is clearly bullshit, and we can prove that it is. So therefore, this book is historical fiction. But that is the only way in which they could have got the truth of the matter across in some kind of outlet like this. The idea is that this individual that's been playing the role of Paul wants to get off his chest what he's been a part of all these years. And he wants to give those who have the eyes to see and the will to want to go there the opportunity to know what went on. And this again is a tenet of Freemasonry and various occult mystery schools and secret societies, where they feel duty bound to tell you the truth of a matter, place the truth in plain sight, revelation of the method, so that we can never make the legitimate claim that we weren't in some way told what was going on. This is a tenet which is very important to these people. So here's the new version of the book. This came out just a few months ago in September 18. This is the 9 after 909 edition. It was released on the 9th of the 9th, 18. 1 plus 8 is another 9. So we have 999 again. And these numbers, as I say, just keep on cropping up. One interesting thing is that William Shepherd, who purports to be the author of these books, states that he's descended from William Wallace, who is this Scottish nobleman turned freedom fighter that was portrayed by Mel Gibson in the movie Braveheart. And this book breaks the incredible bombshell that from 1296, which is the year where William Wallace rose up against the King of Scotland as he began his incursions into, the King of England as he began his incursions into Scotland, all the way through to 1962, which is the year that the Beatles got their first recording contract and first became famous, is 666 years. You couldn't make it up, and you don't have to. Okay, I've got some video snippets now, and these are from various different years and various different sources, but they all reinforce the idea that the individual that came to replace Paul McCartney, or at least the primary player, is indeed a guy by the name of William or Billy. Many, many examples of this. It's not as if there's been any shortage of clues for us all to pay attention to. So the first bit of footage is the original Paul McCartney. I think we can hopefully agree that it is, on an interview with David Frost on TV in 1964. And he's talking about retirement. He was only, 22 years of age then. And he's already talking about retiring from the game, which becomes very interesting. The audio's a bit low on this one, so I hope we can hear it, but I'll do my best.
One day, I mean, does that sort of thing? No, I don't want to be, no, nothing like that, no. God. Retire, that's quite... Retire. And when do you think you'll achieve that ambition? The way things are going in a couple of years or so. No, I don't know. No idea.
So he says he's thinking of retiring, and Frost says, when do you think you'll achieve that? And he says, the way things are going, a couple of years. This was 1964. Yeah. That would have been 1966.
And let's also note the charm with which the real Paul speaks is short, witty sentences, in contrast with the new guy who will warble on at great length about just about anything, and with quite complicated sentences and stuff. So there's an enormous difference in the style of speaking. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
So the next video snippet is from the official video for the song Strawberry Fields Forever. Take special note of what we see in the camera frame when you hear the phrase, nothing is real. Living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all you see. And look at how the Beatles had changed by this point. This was early 67. This is a weird video. This is far out. This is trippy. This is a very far cry from Please Please Me and From Me to You. This is phase 2 in effect. And one of the theories is, and I don't claim to have the definitive answer on this by any means, but one of the theory among certain researchers is that the original Paul was not down with the program that had been set out for the Beatles. So they had an agenda laid out for them from day one. There's a very, very strong suggestion that they were a product of the Tavistock Institute, working out of British military intelligence, specifically to have an influential effect on the culture of the 1960s. And from day one, their role as the primary group in that era was guaranteed and had been laid out for them. And it was known that by 1967, which was the year of the Summer of Love, LSD was everywhere, big social changes in the UK and in America, lots of things going on. The Beatles were expected to be right there at the helm, leading the whole thing and getting kids to buy into flower power and hippie ideals and all of this. And there's a suggestion that the original Paul did not want to be a part of that. And because he'd become a liability and couldn't be relied upon to play his role, that's the reason for him having been replaced. As I say, that's one such suggestion. So the next clue is... All right, so this is Let me just pause that a second. The next clue is from fairly recent times, and it's McCartney giving an interview from behind the wheel of his Jeep as he drives. And he's talking about having joined the Beatles as an already set up affair. So first of all, listen to what he says.
I suddenly realised that I didn't actually know how to set up a band. If you think about it, I'd never actually done it before. I joined the Beatles as an already set up affair.
Now, there's a problem with that in that in official Beatles law, the group was started by John and Paul. George was then brought in to join them, and then Ringo replaced Pete Best as the drummer, and so the lineup that we know was intact. But Paul was one of the early original members. But he's talking here about having joined the group as an already set up affair, which makes no sense. And in actual fact, in a few interviews that this guy has given, he's got his history wrong. He's talked of having a couple of jobs before he joined the Beatles. He said he worked in a couple of factories, which is not the case with the original Paul, according to official Beatles legend. He came straight out of school and joined the band. So he seems to get his stories a bit mixed up and forget his lines sometimes. And on that note, here's a snippet from the Martin Scorsese movie on George Harrison, which came out in early 90s, I think. And there's a clip from that where George, Paul and Ringo are all sitting around reminiscing about the early Beatles days, but there's another problem here in terms of what gets said.
At the beginning, when I joined, Paul was the only one who'd sleep with me.
Well, there was actually a little bit of a thing to that.
I was never very prejudiced.
No, I thought that was the best move, really, because when you joined and you were like the new fella and nobody... And I thought, well, if I hang out with you, then they'll all be like, you know... So I thought it'd be good to, you know...
Put Paul with him.
Yeah.
because
then it would
be all right then.
Yeah, it
so
would,
anyway,
because then
but then it changed. Like... It would be with anybody. I mean, for a while it was with John and I, we didn't.
All right, so George is referring to Paul as the new fella, and he's making out that Paul joined after him and that he brought him into the group, which is not the case. And he's sitting right there. So if that was the original Paul, you'd think he would say, no, George, that's not right, you've got that wrong. But he doesn't dispute it. All right, the next one. We have many references to this guy being referred to as Billy or William. And it goes way beyond anything that can be explained, as far as I'm concerned.
Hello, Neil. How are you? Hello, George. Nice to see you. Very nice. Hello. It's a vegetarian leather jacket. Yeah? Yes. Oh, is that a film?
Yeah, I've got you. You're looking very
I've seen it. It's the one I can see. Go on, turn it off. Yeah, I can see.
No, I don't want to turn it off. Yeah. I've seen it. Sharpie, I've seen the advert for this.
He doesn't seem to like being filmed there. Maybe it's because he's just been called William. So what could be the reason for that? This guy's supposed to be Paul, right? So why does everyone keep calling him William? And here's another one. This is from the movie Give My Regards to Broad Street, which is a Paul McCartney star vehicle that came out in 1984. And the character that he's playing, who is not called William in the movie, walks into a room and somebody says, do you know William?
You know William? Of course. Oh, great. Wonderful.
You know William? Of course. Oh, great. Wonderful.
And he's not disputing that one either. What do we have next?
We all know why John can't be here, and I'm sure he would be, and it's hard really to stand here supposedly representing the Beatles. It's what's left, I'm afraid. But we all loved him so much, and we all loved Paul very much.
So this is the Beatles being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. George and Ringo turned up to accept their award at this event. Paul was absent, and of course Lennon had long been dead by this point. But George, to my ears, quite clearly says, we loved Paul very much. After he speaks about John, he goes on to say, we loved Paul. So have another listen.
We all know why John can't be here, and I'm sure he would be, and it's hard really to stand here supposedly representing the Beatles. It's what's left, I'm afraid. But we all loved him so much, and we all loved Paul very much.
That's what it sounds like to me, anyway. I mean, how many clues do we need? What's the next one? Yeah, this is interesting. So this is a clip from John Lennon's Imagine movie. It was filmed in 1971. The movie was released in 1988. It's behind-the-scenes footage of him making the album. George Harrison drops by at one point, and they're sitting around in the kitchen talking. And as you heard, they make a reference to Beatle Ed. And researchers have been racking their brains over who this could be for a very long time. Nobody seems to know who Beatle Ed could be. But they also clearly refer to Beatle Bill in a sort of piss-taking type fashion. Number 5 in Sweden at the moment. And they say Beatle Bill's making a pig of himself. And you heard there at one point John refers to the Fab 4 ex-Beatles, and then he corrects himself and says, oh, the Fab 3, like one is missing. This is the take that appeared in the movie, but a short while ago, a guy by the name of Josh Reeves, a researcher in the US, came across an outtake from that movie that didn't make the final cut, and it's another version of this scene. Now, most people had taken this scene to be a spontaneous thing that just, erupted in the spur of the moment. But in this alternative take that we're going to see, it's clear that this was rehearsed, and it was no spontaneous thing at all. They'd fully intended to make a reference to Beatle Ed and Beatle Bill, and here's another version of it.
Yoko, is that a fresh pot of tea?
Yes.
It's fairly fresh.
This is actually a Beatle wife fixing the tea for one of the Fab 4 ex-Beatles.
Fab 3.
Fab 3.
See Beatle Bill making a pig of himself.
See much of the Beatles these days, the other Beatles. Beatles
I
are great
saw
round
Beatle Ed.
Beatle Ed, how is he?
He was all right, but he was just going off on a tour.
Beatle Ed's not doing so well these days, is he, Beatle Ed?
Well, he's number 5 in Sweden.
Oh, in Sweden, that's it.
So you see in this version of it, it's Beatle Ed who's number 5 in Sweden, whereas previously it was Beatle Bill. But in both these takes we get the reference to Beatle Bill, and they obviously wanted to get this in there. George dropped many a clue, it would seem, over the years, purporting to, referring to Paul having been replaced by this guy, Billy. There's no shortage of little hints there from George. So the next one up is, speaks for itself.
There is still a chance, Bill, that they will see.
A rare outtake from the recording of the song Let It Be. And for no apparent reason, McCartney inserts the name Bill.
But though they may be parted, there is still a chance, Bill, that they will see.
Now what's that doing in there?
I did want to ask you, can I ask you one final question?
Right, this is a classic one. This is Denny Laine, who is supposedly was supposedly in the Diplomats, alongside Billy Shepherd before he became Paul McCartney, and he later cropped up as part of the lineup of Wings. This is an interview with Denny Laine from a couple of years ago. The interviewer, not sure who he was, but they'd sunk a couple of drinks under their belt, clearly, and it seems the liquor had loosened Denny Laine's tongue somewhat. And the guy asks him what it was like playing with Billy Shepherd in Wings. And you would think Denny Laine would deny it and say, what the hell are you talking about? But his response becomes very interesting. I'll replay it in a minute.
Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, can you cut that? Could have been here all night otherwise. You're an amazing performer. Who the hell's Billy Campbell anyway?
All right, sorry, yeah, he refers to him as Billy Campbell, which is the other name that's constantly given for the Paul replacement besides Billy Shepherd. Let me play this clip again.
What's it like?
I'm new to playing video in presentations, you may have noticed.
Can I ask you one final question? And this is the question I was so scared to ask you about. Can I ask it? Can I ask it? Well, okay.
You've seen this.
I'm going to go in. If you say cut this question, we'll cut it. Just ask the big setup. What was it like playing with Billy Shepherd instead of fucking Paul McCartney?
Who's Billy Shepherd?
I don't know.
Billy Shears.
Ah! Billy Shears Campbell. Thank you. That's all you had to say, my friend. The one and only Billy Shears. Sir, it was an honor to play with you. Can I get a picture made with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, can you cut that?
Could have been here all night otherwise.
You're an amazing performer, sir.
Who the hell's Billy Campbell anyway?
So he's denying it without really denying it. He's denying that he played with a guy called Willie Shepherd or Campbell, but then he goes on to say it was Billy Shears, which is the nickname that was always given to William Shepherd.
If anyone knew who this guy is, it would be Danny Lane, because as you point out, there's 3 different bands that are involved here. So he's seen this guy way back in the past. And we may ask, what is the great fear that holds these people, that they're not prepared to say anything? Or conversely, would he be prepared? Because he's still alive, and he's one of the few people who would know what happened, wouldn't he?
Yeah, well, according to the first version of Memoirs, the public is the last to know about all this. Because in the book, he states that it's a known fact within the music industry that Paul is not the real Paul, that he's been replaced. He says all the groups of the time knew. The Rolling Stones were very much in on it. He says the Rolling Stones actually put out a number of songs hinting at McCartney having been replaced. One of them was Ruby Tuesday, which describes the day when John Lennon first found out about Paul having been replaced. He says Elton John knew about it. He says Donovan knew about it. The Who, most of the groups of the time. It seems we were the last to know. But as we can see, there was never any shortage of clues being offered. And the next one is yet another reference to Billy. And it comes from George Harrison's wife, Olivia, at an event.
What's it like to do what? It's lovely. No, excuse me, I've got to say hello to my friends.
Hello. George's son.
We're going to go on in.
Certainly sounds like Hello Billy to me. And there's George's son Danny, who's the absolute spit of him. Now the one before this is the Hollywood actor Dana Carvey, who was in Wayne's World, and he's recounting an anecdote of having met Paul McCartney. But halfway through it, he makes a bit of a Freudian slip and refers to him as Billy. But he carries on talking, hoping that nobody's noticed. It makes no sense that he would start talking about Paul McCartney and then go into talking about somebody called Billy. See what you think.
It's kind of like when I met Paul McCartney. I'd never even been on Saturday Night Live. He was hanging out at Lorne Michaels' house, and I had the presence of mind at that moment not to go, who wrote A Hard Day's Night? So I said, I talked about his album 1980 and the song Tug of War, and I said, that lyric in the chorus, one day we'll stand up on top of the mountain with our flag unfurled, but it won't be soon enough. And he just lit up. He just lit up. Oh, that was a song, I just pictured a big flag, up on the top of a mountain, And then that was it. That was it. We were fast friends after that. So I think with Billy, people like it if you take one of his obscure songs or obscure album and be very specific about a lyric that he wrote. People love that.
Where did that come from? All right, what else have we got? Okay, final piece of video, all about Heather, Paul's second wife.
You know why I've left you. Protect me, and I will say nothing. Something so awful happened. Someone I'd loved for a long time, I found out had betrayed me immensely, and I don't mean infidelity or anything like that, like beyond belief.
So somebody betrayed you, and of course everyone here is going to believe that that's Paul McCartney. In a way, not infidelity, that is so much deeper than that. It wounded you and pushed you towards suicide.
Yeah, it did. And he knows that.
So it's Paul.
But I've got to protect myself. I have to protect myself. People don't want to know what the truth is, because they could never, ever handle it. They would be too devastated.
This legend went that Paul on the plane crash. Or maybe he did die.
So people could never handle the truth. They would be too devastated. What could she be talking about? In these TV interviews that she gave, there was one with Access Hollywood in the US with Billy Boyle in 2007, and she gave another interview in the UK on TVAM. And in these two appearances, she spoke of having discovered this terrible deception, this terrible secret about Paul McCartney, who she'd been married to. And she made it very clear that she wasn't talking about infidelity. So it's not that she discovered he was having an affair. It's something else. She sounded very scared. She sounded like she was getting hysterical. And she spoke of having stashed away a box of evidence with somebody in a safe place. And she said, if anything happens to me, this box of evidence is going to come out. Now, all of this, to me, sounds consistent with her having discovered that the man she thought she'd married wasn't that guy, and it was actually somebody else. Because the thing about Heather is she gave these interviews in 2007, and don't know if you've noticed, but we haven't heard a whole lot from her since. She doesn't tend to be around anymore. You don't see interviews, you don't see her out at events. So this all smacks of her having been either paid off a huge sum, right? She got a divorce settlement, yeah, or having had the bejesus scared out of her to the point that she doesn't dare speak out about any of this stuff for fear of what may happen. So, you know, in terms of motives as to why so many people would have stayed quiet about this whole thing for so long, because people always ask, what about Paul's family? You know, why would they stay silent about this? Well, there are different possibilities here. You know, huge payoffs to stay quiet can't be discounted. Threats against your personal safety have been known to buy people's silence. But also, with the whole Beatles story, it's very much intertwined, as I've mentioned, with Freemasonry and secret society networks. And these organisations thrive on oaths of secrecy and allegiance to the order, where members swear not to divulge the secrets of what's going on to anyone outside of that group. And this is the way through which these groups attain and hold on to so much of their power. It's a very real thing. We might dismiss it, but to the members of these fraternities, it's a very important tenet, and it would explain how this deception could have taken place for so long. Another thing that has to be considered is that this deception can only have taken place with the full knowledge and complicity of British military intelligence. And isn't it a beautiful irony that we're just a stone's throw from MI6 headquarters? What is it, about half a mile up the road or something? So the Beatles, according to many researchers, were indeed a product of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, which is this social engineering think tank very much connected to MI6, British intelligence. Remember that McCartney was knighted by the Queen in 1997. And there's no way, if he wasn't the original Paul, that wouldn't have been found out by British military intelligence if they were really there to do background checks on people that the Queen comes into contact with and weed out any imposters. If that was what they actually did, it's pretty clear that they would be fully aware of who this guy is, particularly when he was due to come into close contact with the Queen, and they're in on, you know, the act, the deception. That's another factor to bear in mind when we consider how this whole thing could have been kept a secret for 50 plus years. Do you want to jump back in here, Nick, or should we take a break? What do you think? There's plenty more, so maybe we should take a break now, yeah? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. When Paul came to London, he soon moved into the home of Jane Asher, a lovely diva, Shakespearean actress and star. She was in Doctor Who, wasn't she? All sorts of TV programmes.
Child actress as well.
Child actress, yeah. And I think that's as true love, or as near to true love as this story gets. Those two were the rock elite, like rock royalty. They cruised around town, Paul and Jane, and he wrote songs for her. And he lived in the top floor of their flat. It was an immensely talented musical family. Her mum taught music, and her father was a psychiatrist, hypnotist, Richard Asher, who had something in psychiatry named after him, a very distinguished fella. So it was a very special household, that. And there was Paul composing his songs. So that's a very happy image we have. Now, what went wrong? Why did that father, Richard Asher, end up allegedly committing suicide in the basement of that flat? Why was he found dead there after a week? Why is Jane kind of emotionally paralysed? She can never ever talk about Paul at all. She's written 3 books which sell rather well, if you want to read them. She's mainly known for making cakes, isn't she? Making her cakes. But she's written 3 books, all about kind of despair and the kind of horror of life and amnesia, and the way stuff can erupt out of your subconscious in a threatening way, or you might remember him again. I can't forget him, I might remember him again. There's a terrific sense of things being blocked out in her memory if you read those very doomy books that she's composed. So what happened, what the poor girl had to go through, suddenly, when this replacement took place, she was the key feature to give this new guy credibility. This new fool had to be seen walking around with Jane. So we can imagine her father telling her, look, I'm sorry, but you can't grieve in public. You've just got to go with this new guy. So we see pictures of Jane with this new guy who's suddenly inches taller than her. You can see nothing more clearly. You can see how different the new guy is, because walking around with Jane, he looks much taller. Now, how did this happen? I think in '67, he actually gave her an engagement ring. That's the worst mistake she ever made. They were both actors, right? They were both actors. They were both enjoying the role. They weren't terribly suited to each other. People said they seemed rather, Marianne Faithfull sort of said they seemed rather tense together, and she didn't really believe it. They were both actors, and she liked having a Beatle putting his arm around her, but she was a Shakespearean actress. She wasn't into drugs. She wasn't into the drug scene. She wasn't really into the pop music scene, okay? So, Fool, he had to act and be the Beatle, and she gave him credibility of being the Beatle, but it was very stressful for him, totally give up his old identity and rescue the broken band. And she came along, and she sort of clicked with him in America. She was doing a photograph album, a book of photographs of the rock elite. Sort of, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix. She'd got the pictures, and she loved smoking dope, and she loved mingling with the rock crowd. She was actually just the guy for Fool. So just the girl for Fool. They really were in tune with each other, and they really were happy together. And the kind of story is, she said to him, look, I know who you are. I know you're not a Beatle. I can help you to find out who you want to be. And the deal is that I'll be in the band. And so around 1970, she couldn't sing at all, around 1970, as the Beatles broke up, those two went off together. And I think she kind of rescued him, helped him to try and find himself and live on beyond the Beatles, and become kind of more famous and better known than any of them. So we have a mixed up identity, which never makes sense on the usual story, of Jane Asher being given an engagement ring, and much the same time that Fool is actually clicking with this other woman, who is actually much more in tune with. And Jane never recovers from this. And we can see how her father would have been horrified at what's happened to his lovely daughter, and in danger of talking about it, because Richard Asher would have known everything that's gone on, and that's why he had to be silenced. There's a newspaper account of him being, initially it's, oh, he's gone for a walk. He went off the library, does anybody know where he is? That's the initial newspaper account. And then a week later, oh no, and then a highly unlikely account of him taking his own life, which isn't at all credible. So there's quite a lot of deaths in this story, like warnings, don't even think about telling the story. So Jane is very much a victim. She goes into this awful deep silence. She will never talk to anyone about her Paul. Mal Evans was going to write a real story of the Beatles. So he was the roadie. In November '66, he went off to Kenya with Fall, the new guy Fall. It's not very clear, the story. Did they go off with Paul's car or not? And they try to make out that Jane Asher went with them. Well, she wasn't with them. But there's some sort of operation or something Fall had in a hospital in Kenya. But those two went off together, they came back together, so they were always close. And when Fall got married to Linda, I think Mal was the only person invited. Paul's parents were not invited. They weren't even told about it, which is quite important and decisive fact, okay? So Mal was going to write a book about the story of what happened with the Beatles. Apparently he had, yeah. And he'd got the manuscript and everything. And there are letters of permission from, I think, both George and John saying, yes, go on, tell it and see what the hell happens. So he'd got letters of permission from those two. And he was in Los Angeles. And I think he was due to hand the manuscript in a week's time. And then he got shot up by the police. And so that was the end of Paul now. And then cremated. And then his cremation ashes got lost. You know? So it sounds like a sort of John Lennon joke, but anyway, that was the sad end of Mal Evans, roadie. In general, it's astonishing the way nobody tells the story of the Beatles. Just think of all the people around them, Neil Aspinall, they could have made millions, you know. Would a Beatle write a biography? No, they wouldn't. All these people were pressed. Well, why won't you tell the story? Can we please have... There were loads of people who wrote books about the Beatles, but none of the inner clique, they just didn't really, did they? You get George Harrison in his old age, you get a few notes of his published, notes of this and that, but you wouldn't call that a biography. This Billy Shears is really the nearest we have to the untellable story, this terrific secret that cannot be told. Yeah, so there's one page of Mal Evans' book. I think one page has appeared. And it's an account of when they first met in Paul's old home in Cavendish Avenue, when those two came back from Kenya, Nairobi, and they all met up and smoked some dope in November '66 and laughed, and they found they could get on together. And Mal and Fall had been composing, getting the first ideas for Sgt. Pepper, hadn't they? First ideas for that album. So, and then John Lennon was putting his idea of backward playing music. So they had a really good session together, and that is on the one page in Mal Evans' diary or account that survives. That I've
the
seen.
only page, yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're coming on to this fella here. Does this look like Fall to you? Is this the same Fall?
Note the name on the poster behind his head.
Billy.
Billy.
This looks a bit like the guy in the Roof concert, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
You know, remember that Roof concert? A huge, very hairy black hair Fall was playing, and who was he? Okay, oh dear.
One thing that I forgot to mention in part one was, well, last year I met up with a very well-known British record producer. This guy doesn't want his identity put out there, so I'm going to respect that. But this person had worked with a latter-day McCartney. And he says, he was born in the early 50s, this guy. And he says he remembers what would have been sometime in 1966, hearing a radio news bulletin stating that Paul McCartney of the Beatles had been involved in a road accident. And he says it was never repeated. It went out on the radio once and was never heard again. You heard about that, Nick?
Yeah, right.
And
I've heard American sources. American sources.
Yeah, I've also had a woman from America who says that she remembers in 1966 hearing a news bulletin going out over the radio in America stating that Paul McCartney of the Beatles had been killed in a car accident. She remembers it as having stated that he'd been killed. And she says again that bulletin was never rebroadcast. It was just the once. I don't think there are any recordings of this in existence. I think the chances of anyone having a cassette rolling at that time are very slim. So all we've got is people's memories. But it reminds me of the situation with Building 7 on 9/11. And you know, the BBC announcing that Building 7 had collapsed 20 odd minutes before it had. And that story never went out again because it was never supposed to go out in the first place. And as soon as the mistake was realised, the brakes were put on it. So that could be what we're dealing with here. That's a very interesting anecdote from a couple of people in 2 different countries. Just before I go into some alternative suggestions as to what we might be looking at here, I just want to go back to the question of masterful speaking, which again is a tenet of Freemasonry. And it's basically their way of putting the truth out there in plain sight. And so we can never make the claim that we weren't in some way told what was going on. Let me just pause that a sec. So it's their way of absolving themselves of any kind of karmic responsibility or debt as they see it by placing the emphasis and the onus for a situation on us and gaining our tacit approval for it. So we see this playing out in so many different ways through the control system that we have, but it's a very real thing within Freemasonry. And masterful speaking is their way of giving you the truth of a matter, but dressing it up in a very cryptic, encoded way so that only a few people are going to truly understand the message. A few people who are very well versed in the way this dynamic works. And that's really what these books are, because these books have not been marketed in any way, really. They're available on Amazon. You can find out about them, but there's been no great fanfare. They've not been featured in the mainstream. So you've got to be someone that's interested in this subject matter and is going searching yourself off your own back to come across these books. So as they see it, they can say that they're telling you the truth of the matter right here, but you have to go searching for it. And these are all, aspects of revelation of the method. So a very good friend of mine, Mike Williams, who goes by the name of Sage of Quay, really great researcher and broadcaster in the States. He's really delved into this whole McCartney story. And he's very deep in it now, much deeper than he ever intended to be. And he's very much become the Paul is dead guy, much to his disgust. And he's become the go-to man for many people in the States. He's done a ton of work based around these books. And I'll just play you a little bit of a video that he put out last year concerning masterful speaking. There's a little video snippet on the way here.
Straight press coverage of your tour.
What about it?
Were you surprised by the amount? I mean, it's really extraordinary. I mean, the front page of all the magazines.
It sort of started with that thing of, here he is, an ex-Beatle, 10 years later he's coming to play America. Which, funnily enough, I didn't even think about. I didn't realise it was 10 years since I'd played with the Beatles. I just kind of thought...
I didn't realise it was 10 years since I'd played with the Beatles. I just kind of thought... I
was coming on tour. So, I think that's sort of what's done it.
Do you feel any kind of, I guess resentment is much too strong a word, but any kind of hesitation about the fact that you will always, in all probability, be identified as a former Beatle?
No, I don't mind it. I'm always going to be identified by my real name, also Paul McCartney.
No, I don't mind it. I'm always going to be identified by my real name, also Paul McCartney.
But that doesn't bother me. And ex-Beatle is another kind of tag, which doesn't bother me. Now, I'm proud of what I'd done.
You find he touches his nose a lot in interviews. And what a strange thing to say, identified by my real name, also Paul McCartney. And he said there that he's talking about it's been 10 years since I played with the Beatles, which could be interpreted as it's 10 years since I joined the Beatles, 1966, because this is 76. And the thing about masterful speaking is there's always plausible deniability involved. So if ever these people were called up to account for what they've just said, they can always write it off in some sort of harmless, meaningless way. So he could have just said, oh, I was talking about, in 66 when the Beatles were touring in the States. And there's plausible deniability in these books as well, because they've told you it's historical fiction. So if anyone ever tried to bring a legal case against you, Harriet, or anyone else involved in this book, they could say, look, we've told you it's fiction. So these stories are clearly not true. It's an ingenious way of communicating the truth, but being able to deny it when you're called upon to do so. Here's another example of masterful speaking, which Mike Williams highlighted. So Paul is getting this honour for contribution to the arts. He makes a speech. He says, I see this as a huge honour for me and my family, and I think of how proud my Liverpool mum and dad would have been to see this. It's a bit of a strange thing to say, isn't it? My Liverpool mum and dad. Your mum and dad are your mum and dad, no matter where they happen to come from. So it's his way of referring to Paul's mum and dad in the interpretation of this.
In toward the end of the 60s, is that when the rumors about you being dead surfaced? Do you remember that? Do you remember how that started? What were your feelings about that?
What happened? Yeah, my feelings. What happened was we did a cover for a record called Abbey Road, and we... See, even the cover gets applause. And the idea was to walk across the crossing, and I showed up that day with sandals, flip-flops, and so it was so hot, and I kicked them off and walked across barefooted. So this started some rumor that because he was barefooted, he's dead. I couldn't see the connection myself.
No, I don't. It seems like a long, slow, difficult death. Being barefooted will kill you.
Scorched feet.
And what how do you manage something like that? Because it was a global rumor.
Yeah. I mean, I just laughed at it and knew it was just because of the fame and the craziness. It was an American DJ, so you guys are to blame.
Yeah.
Not you personally, but no, the thing is, I just laughed it off, but it was a little bit strange because people did start looking at me like,
right.
Is it him or a very good double?
Well, that was the idea. That was the other part of it, that there was a guy who looked like you taking your place.
No, well, this is him.
Yeah. Or is it?
So there he is on David Letterman's show in 2009, which is the year the first memoirs came out, and they're having a laugh about the whole Paul is dead theory. And there's two ways of interpreting it, because on one level he appears to be owning up to it, and he's saying, I'm the guy that replaced him. But if ever they were called upon to explain themselves more fully, he could say, well, obviously I was just having a laugh about it, and I was just highlighting how ridiculous this whole conspiracy theory is. So there's two ways of interpreting what he's saying there. And Letterman would have been in on this. Letterman, there's rumours he's a Freemason as well, because most of these high-ranking celebrities are in these types of influential positions. So he would be fully aware of who this guy really is. As I say, the public is very much the last to know. Nick mentioned earlier original Paul's brown eyes. There aren't many colour photos of him, because back in the early to mid-60s, the photography was all black and white. But we get a few photos showing his natural eye colour. And it's very much at odds with the blue eyes, sometimes green, sometimes blue, depending on what contacts he's put in, I guess, of the current day one. So I'm going into some alternative takes here, and I don't present these to deliberately try and confuse people, although I'm as confused as hell, so everyone else might as well be as well. You would think that when you research this subject, the more hours you spend on it, the more crystal clear the whole thing becomes. And that couldn't be further from the truth. The more time you invest into this, the more confounded and confused and bitter and screwed up you become. Trust me on that. It's not easy, but you get obsessed. And so there are different researchers that have some alternative takes on this, and I'm mentioning it just to give a fair airing to them, and so that I've presented you with the complete story in terms of how many people see it. And we all have to leave here and make our own minds up as to what it's all about. So there are researchers who are of the view that we haven't just had one guy replacing the original Paul. There's been more than one replacement. And we can look at photos like this side by side. And if you look at either of these in isolation, an average member of the public would say, well, that's Paul McCartney. It's not until you put them side by side like this and you start to do comparisons that you realise the discrepancies that there are between the different Pauls. This is a photo montage put together by Mike Williams, Sage of Quay. He put this out last year, I think. And so we went scouring the internet for all these different presentations of Paul McCartney. And it becomes very interesting when you put them side by side like this. So the guy in picture 1, I think we would all take that to be the original biological Paul. That's what he looked like. Now we start to look at some of these other Pauls, and we can see straight away there's some glaring differences between them. So I don't know who this one is, but he doesn't look anything like any of the others. This is the guy we think of as Billy Shears, who first emerged in late 66 and started doing interviews in 67 around the time of Sgt. Pepper. Don't know who this one is. Looks more like Sylvester Stallone to me. Don't really know who this one is. This is a Wings era, sort of 70s McCartney. This one doesn't appear to match any of the others. So the theory is that there was a one full-time replacement for Paul who got the gig, who would be William Shepherd, Billy Shears. So the suggestion is you have the one guy that got the full-time gig, but there were a number of fill-ins and part-time cameo Pauls that popped up from time to time as well. So straight away we're starting to get very convoluted here. So there's one montage. Here's another one that Mike put together, and we have the same problem. Many of these look nothing like each other. Obviously we're going through the ages here, but this looks like a very young version of the present day Paul, the guy we have now. That's what it looks like to me. This was taken in 1960 by Astrid Kircher. It was a photo shoot in Hamburg of John Lennon and Paul. Now, he doesn't look anything like this one, and yet this is the guy we think of as the real Paul. So is it the case that this is the replacement Paul in his younger years? Because if you follow the narrative of the memoirs books, it tells you that William Shepherd had to undergo plastic surgery and radical appearance modification to become Paul. He had latex and fillers and all sorts of stuff injected into his face. And yet here he is, with no evidence of any surgery having taken place, looking like a young version of the present day Paul, when he wasn't supposed to have come on the scene until 1966, but this is 1960. We have the video to the song Wonderful Christmas Time, 1979, and what you have in the video is what appears to be Paul with a mirror image of himself, but actually two Pauls. So it's different Pauls in the same video. So what's going on here? Because by this point, the original Paul is supposed to be long dead, and we've got a replacement. But now we've got two Pauls in the same friggin' video. Here's one for people to ponder on. The first picture is from the video to Hey Jude in September 68. By January 69, 4 months later, we're supposed to accept that he's grown a full bushy beard and grown his hair out in just 4 months. Has anyone grown a beard like that in 4 months? Looks to me like a clear indication that we've got different Pauls there. So again, there's at least two guys by this point, at least two guys playing the role of Paul. A lady by the name of Tanya Olive Betts, who I've been communicating with on Facebook, who's very into this whole subject as well, has got a whole world of photographic evidence, sent me these two pictures of the 1964 A Hard Day's Night tour. And she claims that there are two separate Pauls popping up on this tour. Here's picture number one. That's supposed to be Paul. From the same tour, this is dated 1964 as well, we have this Paul, who appears to be quite a bit taller than the others in that picture, unless it's a trick of where he stood. This is from Let It Be, the movie, which was filmed in January '69. It was the month that we had that famous rooftop concert on the EMI studios. So here's the bearded Paul. But here's another Paul from the same Let It Be sessions. And it's a shame that his arm is in the way. But what we can see is, it doesn't look great on this screen, but you can see it more clearly on the original photo. His whiskers here are broken. So you see some skin there. And that indicates that he's not wearing a full beard. He's got the sideburns and they stop there. Otherwise, you'd see the continuation of them. So we have a Paul with a beard and a Paul without a beard. And yes, you might say, maybe he shaved it off. But there are other pictures from the same Let It Be sessions which appeared to show a bearded Paul and a non-bearded Paul. Are we all confused yet? Here's Paul back to back with Ringo. In the first picture, he's standing head and shoulders above him. In the second picture, he's only marginally taller than him. That's a latter day Paul and Ringo. So is that two different guys? The noses certainly look different. The present day one has a more hooked, pointed, beaky kind of nose, whereas the original Paul had a much flatter nose. Is it the same Ringo? Wow. There are some researchers. There's a lady by the name of Tina Foster that runs the Plastic Macca blog site, and she's of the view that all the Beatles were replaced. I can only handle one at a time, and I'm still stuck on Paul. So Ringo will have to wait to another day.
On the wall race questions with John as well, actually.
One Beatle at a time. This is an official Beatles magazine article from, I think, 1964. And it gives all the sort of vital details of each one of the Beatles, and it gives their heights. So in 1964, this magazine is alleging that Ringo stood at 5'8", and John, Paul and George were all 5'11", all the same height. So we would expect to see, in photos, the three of them more or less the same height, and Ringo quite a bit shorter, but we don't always see that. Not sure where this picture first emerged from, but it's been highly circulated on the internet, and people claim that it shows three Pauls on a riverboat. So the first one is supposed to be here, looking very much like an early 60s mop top original biological Paul. Then the next one is down here, who looks far more like the Paul we saw in Magical Mystery Tour from the 1967 era. I've got a much clearer version of the photo on the screen if anyone wants to look later. And then we have another character here who appears very much like the moustached Paul who gave the interview on LSD and was very much around during that Sgt. Pepper era. The problem we have with pictures on the internet is, of course, that they are open to potential doctoring. And many people claim that manipulation has taken place, also with video footage, old video footage. The only way to really verify photographs is to go back to original sources, original books and original print magazines is the only way to be sure of what we're really looking at. If this really has been a military intelligence grade operation, and it's been a masterclass in deception and duplicity at the general public's expense, then you would expect things like manipulation of photographs to have taken place at the very least. Another theory is that what we've been looking at all these years is twins. There's a researcher by the name of Miles Mathis who has put out many articles, very controversial, very contentious stuff. He claims that a lot of events that have been presented to us as real, newsworthy things never actually took place, were hoaxes. And one of them, he claims, is that we've been led to believe that there's been one Paul McCartney all these years, and in actual fact, he was one of twins. So in this article that he put out a few years ago, he's included what purport to be photographs of the original twin brothers. And he claims that what we have here is Paul and Mike McCartney. And that the individual that's been presented to us as Mike McCartney, Paul's brother, otherwise known as Mike McGear, is an actor. He's an actor that was hired to play that role, to throw people off the track of the fact that we actually have brothers, Paul and Mike. Really don't know what to make of this one. There's a few other people that seem to agree with it. There's a guy called Mark Tokarski that's put out articles on this as well. Paul did release an album in the 90s called Twin Freaks, if that's anything to go by. This is supposed to be an original photo of the parents, Mary and Jim McCartney, with the two boys. This is Paul and Mike in the 60s. Don't look a whole lot like brothers to me. Well, yeah, is it another Mike? It's purported to be Mike. That's Mike, and that's A. Paul. As to which one it is, you tell me. So some researchers are of the view that the real Paul never actually died, and that the conspiracy theory about him having perished in that car crash in 1966 is a hoax designed to throw us all off track. I'm not saying I subscribe to any of these, I'm just presenting the different options to you. So this person, Tanya, that sent a whole load of photographs to me over the months, has included a bunch of pictures which she claims show the original Paul in a latter-day guise, showing that it's the same guy who's still around. That's not to say that others haven't been used to play the public role, but the original guy is still around. And so the suggestion is we might have a full-time replacement actor and the original guy paging in and out of the role. So sometimes you see the one of them, other times you're looking at the other. She claims that this could be the same guy, a latter-day version of the original Paul. I don't know what we think about that. Let's look at some others. Is this the same guy? Years apart. Could be, maybe not. This one, so we're back to that picture from earlier. Is this a more aged version of the same guy? Well, there's a couple of people that worked in crime prevention in Italy, professional forensic scientists, and they were going to do an article for Wired magazine in Italy, and the intention was to blow this stupid conspiracy theory out of the water once and for all, and just show how ridiculous it was. And when they compared old photos from the 60s with the present day Paul, they came to discover that it couldn't possibly be the same person, and they published these findings in that article. And there was also voice comparisons that were done by this guy, Dr. Henry Truby, right? That's right, yeah. University of Florida. And he took 3 songs from different eras, which all purport to be Paul on the vocals, and did voice print analyses of the songs. And his conclusion was that it was 3 different people on these 3 songs. So we can make of that what we will. Is this the same guy? Or this? Original Paul is supposed to have been long gone by the time of that second photo. And this is quite interesting because we have Paul on a chat show in the 60s and decades later, present day Paul, and they're striking the almost identical pose. Is this a personal mannerism, or has this guy learnt to mimic and emulate what the original guy did? These are all questions we're faced with. Oh God, John Halliday. Just in case anyone's brain is not suitably fried yet, this will do the job. Some people think that this guy could be the original Paul McCartney in a rather dishevelled, worse for wear state in present day. His name is John Halliday, and he's the caretaker of Paul's original childhood home in Liverpool. And there's footage of him on YouTube, and certain people seem to think that he displays some of the mannerisms and some of the affectations of the original Paul. And they're questioning whether, Paul could have been pushed out of the Beatles back in the 60s, fell on hard times, and this is how he looks now. I do hope not. But I throw it in there in the interests of completism. So, do we have a present-day Paul interacting with a model of himself from the 60s, or do we have an absolute charlatan here who is knowingly taking the piss because that is not him, but he's just deceived us all into thinking this could be the case? Earlier this year, there was a promotional photograph that was put out through the McCartney camp to promote his latest tour. And isn't it interesting that there are 2 Pauls featured in this photo? It's not been doctored in any way. This is the way that it was put out there. And also an interview that he did earlier this year. I was one of the Beatles. Can you believe it? Well, can you? a lot of people think that there's not really much to this story and it's all a bit trivial and it doesn't really matter, and they can't understand why guys like us spend so long looking at it. I don't see it that way at all. Like I said earlier, the one thing I can say with certainty is there's been more than one Paul McCartney. That alone is evidence of deception and duplicity and us being made mugs of. And I don't appreciate being made a mug of. Never have. And when I discover that it's happened, I want to understand how and the methods and the tactics that were used. This replacement, as I said earlier, can only have taken place with the complicity of military intelligence. And so it becomes a matter of great importance that one of the most famous people in the world could have been switched right in front of our noses and we've not been told about it. That pisses me off, and that motivates me to want to try and understand what's gone on here. It appears that there is a disclosure process underway through these books. A lot of people say that we can't trust them too much because, by Hugh Harriot's own admission, these are works of historical fiction, but they do contain such a huge amount of very detailed information to suggest that whoever wrote these books has inside knowledge of what goes on inside the Beatles camp. It's either that or they've got a very vivid imagination and a lot of time on their hands. If this book didn't come out of the official Beatles/McCartney camp, this guy would be up to his neck in legal cases by now, and he'd be in all kinds of trouble for the stories he's putting across in this. But that hasn't happened, which does suggest to me that this is a method of disclosure and revelation of the method, and it seems as if they're trying to get this off their chest in what is clearly becoming the latter days of this guy, whoever he is. Now, if he's William Shepherd and he was born in 1937, he turns 82 this year. So how long has he got left? I mean, even by elite standards, 10, 15 years tops, right? So with a bit of luck, most of us in this room will still be around when this guy, whoever he is, passes. And it wouldn't surprise me if after he has, we get to discover a lot more about what's really gone on here. And I'm thinking in terms of the disclosure we got after Jimmy Savile. We only found out the true nature of Jimmy Savile after he'd passed. And I wonder if that's some kind of tenet that's involved in this as well, where you only get to discover the truth of a matter after somebody has gone and is no longer accountable for it. Obviously, his kids would have some explaining to do, but it wouldn't surprise me if we get a major bombshell whenever he passes and we come to discover much more about this story. In the meantime, we're just left to make the best of it based on the information available to us, and that's really all I've got to say.